Um, I gave my first extension talk in Washington State, in Yakima, Washington, in the winter of 1986. And in those intervening years, I've given many, many talks. And this is perhaps my last extension talk that I'll give in my career. And so I've thought about what are the things that I've learned in the past 35 plus years that I could share with this audience today. And this is the topic I came up with. It's based on phone calls that I have had through the years, and hopefully you're seeing the right screen.
Yeah, it's coming through just fine.
Perfect. So I titled it Mistakes to Avoid in Planting Tree Fruit and Tree Nut Orchards, particularly in northern Utah. So over my career, I fielded a lot of calls from people who have plans to do various things. And I think one of my responsibilities as an extension specialist was to try to save people money, to try to keep them from doing things that are arguably knuckleheaded. So let me tell you about a handful of these phone calls that I've had. I spent the early part of my career at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And most every year that I was there, I got a phone call or two from a couple, and usually they were approaching retirement, and they would call and say, we're going to be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. I think they were old enough that they could finally access their 401k plan funds. And we thought that having an apple orchard would be a really great retirement project. And they would go on and on about the fruit that they were going to buy and the way that they were going to do things, and you know, they were going to plant their favorite apples that they couldn't get at local pick your own orchards, and they certainly couldn't find at the grocery store. And after I listened politely, and then I would ask a single question, and that question was, who's going to buy your fruit? And then usually it got really quiet on the other side of the conversation, because they hadn't thought about that. They had all their plans about how they were going to grow fruit, but had given little thought to marketing it. And they sometimes had some ideas. Oh, there's this commercial orchard down the road, and we'll have them pack them. And I tried to disabuse them of that. You know, maybe they would pack them for you, but that would be at a cost. And if you have a high cull rate, it's going to cost you even more. Another one I heard, and I know Dr. Black has fielded calls like this from people who wanted to plant grape vineyards, and I'm going to reflect on a conversation Dr. Black and I had. Somebody contacted him. They were looking at land in Carbon County. It was ostensibly in USDA hardiness zone 7, so the winter temperature shouldn't have been a problem. But when you looked at the location, it was going to have a growing season of about 85 days. And grapes are 190 day crop, preferably over 200 days. So that wasn't going to work. And obviously I ran into those in Wisconsin. Grapes are not very happy in a cold climate like Wisconsin. And there are places in northern Utah. I had people talk to me about growing grapes in the Bear Lake Valley, you know, with an 80-day, maybe 70-day growing season, and they're just never going to mature a crop there. Another two, the sea buckthorn or sea berry and filbert orchards have the same problem. In this case, these were people who had planted these crops as a nursery crop and then were trying to sell the plants to people, telling them that this was going to be a great crop, but they couldn't tell them about market because there really wasn't a market. And so would these things grow? Yeah, they would. But would they be competitive in the marketplace if there was a market? Well, no. So these were people who were trying to make money selling nursery plants, knowing that there really wasn't a market for the crop once it was done. And then blueberries. You know, every year I go to the big box stores and they'll have a display of blueberries for sale, the nursery plants, and I shake my head and say, well, this is great business for you, because those folks will be back next year or a couple of years buying more blueberry plants after they have succumbed to high pH soils that we have in Utah. And early on in my career, I fielded a letter from a man who wondered why they could grow blueberries and peaches in Michigan across from Milwaukee, and he couldn't grow them in Milwaukee. Well, it's because of the side of the lake they're on and the side of the lake you're on. Blueberries are not very winter hardy. And so in northern Utah, they're going to be marginally hardy, and then we've got high pH soils. Now I need to temper that a little bit. There are some microclimates where blueberries will grow well, but largely that's not a crop for Utah. So why do these plans fail? People have great plans and they want to do good things, but this is my list of the problems that they run into. The first is market, as I said before. They haven't done their market research. They don't know who's going to buy the fruit. That is the first thing that you should figure out if you're planning any sort of an agricultural endeavor, is who is going to buy my product. And if you don't know the answer to that question, you keep looking until you do have the answer. And once you have the market figured out, then the growing part will come pretty quickly after that. The second reason that plantings fail is poorly adapted plant materials. Not adapted to the soil, not adapted to the climate. And that can be disease problems, it can be root rot problems, all of those kinds of things. The next would be lack of local infrastructure. When I was in graduate school, I remember having a conversation with one of the professors, and he was asking the question, why aren't watermelons grown in central Washington? And apparently they weren't at the time. They had a long enough growing season, they could be grown there. And his answer was that there just wasn't the local infrastructure for packing and shipping watermelons. And I'm not sure that they would ship the kinds of distances that other fruits coming out of Washington would. The next is lack of pest management alternatives. I had a lengthy meeting with a man who had made his living suing pesticide companies on behalf of potato growers in Wisconsin, and he was interested in growing lingonberries. And these are a cousin to cranberries and blueberries, sort of intermediate between the two. And he assured me that any pesticide that was registered for cranberries was also registered for lingonberries. And he should have known better. That wasn't true. It's more true today than it was then. But you need to make sure that for whatever crop you intend to grow, that there are pesticides that are registered for that crop. Thus, sea berry, sea buckthorn, that's a problem. I don't think there are any insecticides or herbicides for that matter that are registered for that crop. And without the ability to manage those pests, you're just out there in the wind. And then the last is lack of operator skill or lack of operator attention. And another professor taught that, you know, the system that you use for growing fruit should be based in part on your affinity for fishing. If fishing is your passion, then you better choose a lower input approach. But if growing fruit is your passion, then many things would work for you. This is one of my colleagues, a county agent in Wood County, Wisconsin, since retired, by the name of Todd Planer. And this was his favorite saying: don't make vast plans with half-vast ideas. And if you say that really quickly, you'll get his meaning. And it carries a true message. So consider that as you make your plans. Don't make vast plans with half-vast ideas. So let's talk about choosing plant material. I think a common foible is that some people have grown a fruit tree or two, and they have something that they really enjoy eating and that grows well for them. And they think that if they plant 10 acres of that everybody else is going to enjoy the same things that they do. Well, it's obvious that that isn't the case. I'm trying to come up with the name of, there's an apple cultivar that is very popular around Minneapolis, Haralson, there it is. But if you get 200 miles from Minneapolis, nobody's heard of it. And it's an okay apple, but if we grew Haralson apples in northern Utah, nobody would buy them because they have no idea what Haralson apples are about. So you need to plant what people know and what they will buy. The second is, I can't tell you the number of orchards and other fruit plantings that have failed because they go to get nursery stock and they contact the nursery and they say, what have you got? instead of saying, this is what I want, and I'm willing to wait for you to propagate it. And in fact, if you contact a commercial tree fruit nursery today, they probably don't have anything in inventory. They future contract. And so you're 2 years out from getting trees, but you will get the scion and the rootstock that you want. And that will give you the greatest chance for success. Many times I visited fruit orchards and why did you choose this? Well, we called the nursery and that's what they had. And I'm thinking to myself and didn't say it. Well, yeah, they had it because nobody else wanted it and you bought it. And now that's your problem. And you're going to have to live with this. So nursery scams is what I was talking about with the sea buckthorn and the filberts. These are people who are more interested in selling plant material than they are in having a marketable crop. They haven't thought about markets. The filbert market is dominated by Turkey. The Turkish government subsidizes agriculture and they dump their crops in the US below the cost of production. We see that in tart cherries as well. So, that's just an uphill battle. And many of the filberts that are available, the native filberts, are this size. They're the size of a small grape or maybe large blueberry size. These aren't the filberts that are grown in Turkey and in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And they're bushy, they're shrubby. I'll show you some pictures of those in just a minute. And then to repeat, the plant material needs to be adapted to the soil. It needs to be adapted to the climate. You need to know what the pest complex will be or might be. And some of those pests you might bring in on plant material and your operator skill. Plant a few plants and learn how to grow it well before you plant 10 acres. Now let's talk about some specific things. In apples and peaches, cultivar choice is extraordinarily important. Marketability, again, and then season of ripening. If you think that you need to grow Granny Smith apples, that's going to be a tough job to do in northern Utah. Our growing season is simply not long enough. And this might be a good time to talk a little bit about club varieties. If you've been to the grocery store recently, you will probably have seen Cosmic Crisp apples. And you can buy apples, but you can't buy trees unless you are planting them in the state of Washington. And there are other varieties like that that are similar. Pink Lady, Sugar Bee, Envy, and the availability of trees is limited, so you can't buy those and legally plant them in Utah. Rootstocks are incredibly important for peaches and for apples, and there are better choices than others. Not much size control in peaches, but there is good size control for apples. Dwarfing rootstocks are precocious, they're more productive, they're just a better choice. And if you can learn to grow your apples on dwarfing rootstocks, your opportunity for profitability will be much higher than if you think you're going to plant them on semi-dwarfing rootstocks. You need to consider packing and shipping. How are you going to pick and pack and ship your crop to get it to market? And then if you're thinking about doing pick your own, you need to decide if you're willing to give up your Saturdays and Sundays and how much you enjoy dealing with the general public. A young lady who graduated from this department was working at a local retail nursery and is moving on to wholesale nursery work because she just was tired of dealing with retail customers. Fair enough, I understand that. For apricots, pears, and plums, spring frosts are a problem for many of these, particularly for apricots. For pears, fire blight. There's a reason that we don't have a pear industry in Utah. They're so highly susceptible to fire blight. We have fire blight endemic in the state. Much of our fire blight is antibiotic resistant. Pears are just not a good choice. Winter injury to pears a little bit and to plums the problem. And then the market for these crops. There is a market for them, but it can be saturated very easily. And then none of these have dwarfing rootstocks. Pears a little bit, but the dwarfing rootstocks in pears are not fully hardy in Utah. And apricots and plums, I see in the nursery catalogs, dwarf apricot, dwarf plum. I'm sorry, there are no dwarfing rootstocks for apricots or plums. They're naturally not very big trees. Well, apricots can be huge sometimes. Um, but beware of nursery hype. Blueberries, they're going to suffer from winter injury here if they're not protected, if it's not a good protected site. Soil pH is our biggest struggle. They want a soil pH 5, 5.5. That's where they're happiest. Our soils in Utah are 7.5 to 8, and the soils are highly buffered. And every time you irrigate, you're adding more alkalinity, more calcium carbonate to your soil. So to adjust soil pH is just virtually impossible. Now you can do some excavate and replace kinds of things, but those are short-lived. But if you have priced blueberries at Sam's Club or Costco compared to what you can grow them for here, it's cheaper to buy them at the warehouse stores than it is to produce them here. Some miscellaneous small fruits, so currants, gooseberries, juneberries, honeyberries. The biggest problem with these is how do you get the fruit harvested? There are mechanical harvesters that will harvest these. For honeyberries, sometimes called haskaps, they're not ripe one day and they're on the ground the next. So commercially, it's just not a great crop. Now, how are you going to harvest that? You won't find harvest labor to get it done. Thorns, the gooseberries, this picture doesn't have thorns, but thorns are a problem with gooseberries. And the other problem are the residual floral parts. If you look at the end of the fruit, that's the remnants of the flowers, and those have to be rubbed off before they're eaten. And so there's some processing required for all of these in order to be eaten. And that just reduces demand. People don't have the time or the inclination to do that kind of work now. And just a word about strawberries. And I remember having this conversation with one of my predecessors here at USU, and I asked, well, why is there no pick your own strawberry industry in Utah? And he explained to me that Utah is the safety valve for the California industry. So California ships strawberries into Utah at a lower price than can be grown locally. At our local grocery store today, I can go and I can buy 4 1-pound packages of strawberries for $5, $1.25 a quart or a pound. I can't grow them for that price. Now, they're not really great right now, but there's no local strawberries right now. And who has time to pick strawberries? Utah is perhaps a little unique in that, but by and large, people don't make the time. Both parts of a couple are working, and to go pick strawberries and make jam, that just isn't something that people do anymore. And are you going to get harvest labor if you're going to sell them ready picked? Where are you going to get that labor? Are you going to get young people to pick fruit versus working at In-N-Out or Chick-fil-A? Good luck with that. That's a problem. Or if you're in southern Utah, they'll be cleaning motel rooms in the summer. Almonds. USU hopefully will be releasing 2 almond cultivars soon. One is soft shelled, the other is hard shelled. We know that they're hardy into zone B, zone 6B. Do they have commercial potential? Maybe, but probably not. And one of the reasons is that there's no infrastructure. I'm sure you could grow almonds here, and how are you going to get them harvested? You got to have a shaker, and then what? Where are you going to take them to have the husks removed and to be shelled and to be processed and sold? You've either got to buy the equipment, and we don't have nearly enough acreage to support operating that kind of equipment. So infrastructure is a great big deal. Otherwise, you're shipping them to California, and there goes your profitability. Hardy filberts. These are shrub type. There are filberts that are hardy here that produce nuts most year. They flower about now. The picture on the right here is a filbert shrub, and I held my camera in my right hand and had a stick in my left hand and gave it a good poke. And that's the pollen cloud. They're wind pollinated. Well, you can see the snow on the mountains in the distance. This was taken in early March several years ago, and they will freeze. But the biggest problem is if you look at the picture on the left, these are filberts growing in Dayton, Idaho. and they're shrubby. How would you get a shake harvester under those? And they just want to be shrubby. And then the other problem is pest management. Many of the pesticides that are registered for filberts are 24C registrations or registrations only for Oregon. So just because it's registered for use in Oregon doesn't necessarily mean that it's registered for use in Utah. You need to know where your pesticides are registered before you make your planting. Walnuts. There are black walnuts, English walnuts, and heart nuts or Japanese walnuts will grow in Utah and crop. They're great, big, huge trees. I know there are English walnuts all up and down the Wasatch Front in people's yards here and there, and they survive and produce crops. Quality isn't really great, but they drop. But the biggest problem with them is pest management. Walnut husk fly is a problem. It makes the husk all black and nasty, and it makes the husk stick to the shell of the nut. And if you've got a 40-foot tall tree, how are you going to spray that? We sprayed some that we had with an air blast sprayer that we had, and we blew insecticide up a good way into the tree, but it wasn't enough. And we still had walnut husk fly up in the top of that. And then harvesting and processing. If you want to grow black walnuts, good luck getting the kernels out of the shell, maybe with a vise, and then the kernels are broken. Pistachio, there are some pistachios that are hardy here. They have male and female trees. They're dioecious. But the problem is they're difficult to propagate. We could never figure out how to vegetatively propagate the stock. If you propagate by seed, half of the trees roughly will be male and half will be female, but it will be 8-9 years before they express whether they have male or female flowers, and you need about one male per 9 or so females, but you're going to get about 1-to-1 initially. The other problem is they have small nuts. The shells don't dehisce always. The trees are really gummy. And then again, harvesting those and processing. And understand that pistachio is strongly biennial bearing. They bear a crop one year and no crop the next. And that's a tough way to make a living if you only get a crop every other year. And then infrastructure again. Where are you going to take your fruit? I know that there are a couple of pistachio orchards in Washington County, and they have developed that infrastructure for them. So you might ask yourself the question, why hasn't this crop been grown locally before? Well, for the very things I've been talking about: climate, lack of improved cultivars, particularly for the small fruits. Pest management is an ongoing problem. Labor is an ongoing challenge. And then infrastructure. Are there consultants and other people who can help you? So not everyone else is intellectually challenged or timid or risk averse. Some people have looked at these and they've decided that it's not a crop for them, and probably for good reason. And if you'll take time, you may come to the same conclusion. So to conclude with, here's some advice. Stick with what works. Get the very best plant materials that you possibly can. Know your market, know who's going to buy your product. Have a pest management plan that works and is legal for materials that are registered for the crop and for the state. Know your source of labor. I wouldn't count on your children and grandchildren necessarily. And finally, remember the advice of Todd Planer: don't make vast plans with half-vast ideas. So thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Teryl. We do have just a couple questions. Just a reminder, if you want to put questions in the Q&A box, that allows us to keep them after Teryl is done, and he can answer those once we're on to our next presentation. So we had a couple questions. We'll ask those. We have just about 3 minutes. So it was asked, are almonds a wise tree to pick in this area because of how much water they need?
Well, I don't think their water needs are any different than peaches. They're essentially identical to peaches.